seminars. Also, thank you very much for the nice introduction, Christoph. I think I wouldn't have done such a nice introduction on myself, but I'm very pleased with it actually. Today I will talk about foraging in stingless bees and the influence of ambient temperature, environmental temperature on the dynamics of these foraging processes, and also in the last part of my talk a little bit on competition among social bees. So just to, oops. Just to start, to give a little bit of context, what I'm going to talk about or what we are going to hear today is we're going to talk about social bees. As far as I've seen, most of the talks in the series of seminars was about social bees, mostly about honeybees. Here I give you a very, very brief review on the variety of social bees that we have. So as usual, social bees, we have three big groups, which is the honeybees, the bumblebees, and the stingless bees. What are social bees? Social bees, as you all might know, they have produce colonies, so they're not solitary foraging individuals. They produce colonies where the queen is responsible for laying the eggs, and the vast majority of the bees within the colony are workers that execute different tasks during their lifetime. One of these tasks is foraging. Here we have some examples. Here's an Apis colony, Apis florea. Here is a bumblebee colony, and here's a stingless bee colony, or part of the colony. The stingless bees, Meliponini, are the biggest group of social bees. We have currently more than 500 species. I think it's 520 species described worldwide. In comparison with the bumblebees, which have more than 250 species described, and the honeybees, Apini, with, depending on the literature and the sources, around 11 species described worldwide. So we have the vast majority of social bees worldwide are stingless bees. Okay, this is very, very nice. Christoph once gave a talk showing how the contribution in literature on stingless bees is the lowest one. So we have the vast majority of social bees are stingless bees, yet the least we'll know least about them, given that most researchers focus primarily on honeybees and secondarily on bumblebees. So we have very little knowledge so far on stingless bees. Stingless bees occur in the tropics. So here we have a map representing in blue the parts where stingless bees may occur, not necessarily they occur in all the blue parts, but where they may occur. And as you can see, it's in the tropical region and the southern subtropical regions worldwide. And the vast majority of these 520 species, which is about 300 species, occur in the neotropics. So we have from Mexico downwards, all of Latin America, even in the Argentinian part, we have occurrences of stingless bees. So we have around 300 species. In Brazil alone, we have close to 200 species. So 200 species of different stingless bees. What is the problem now for stingless bees related to ambient temperatures, to environmental temperatures? First of all, you may think, okay, they live in the tropics, so they have a nice and warm climate. They have food in abundance year round, which is mostly true. But one of the big problems is the possibility of a climate change and raise in ambient temperature. Here we have a study by Hrncir from 2020. And what these researchers show is that species in tropical regions, invertebrate species, I think that they did their study especially on insects, that they live very close. Here's their habitat, the temperature of their habitat where they live. Here's the optimum temperature, and they live very close to their optimum temperature. In invertebrates, here we have a small excursion into physiology. In invertebrates, in insects, we have the big problem that the metabolic rate and their activity, it increases as ambient temperature increase or body temperature increases until they reach the optimum. And shortly after their optimum, or in temperatures a little bit above their optimum, this activity and the metabolism decreases abruptly, and the individuals die. So they bees or insects in the tropics, which live very close to their thermal optimum, they have this problem that once the ambient temperature goes beyond this optimum temperature, they will be stressed thermically, and there might occur very bad injuries, physiological injuries that lead to the death of the individuals. You can see the tolerance that species have. Here we have the latitude. So we can see here that the animals, insects close to the equator, that they have a lower tolerance of warming, or in other words, of increasing ambient temperature than have animals or insects in lower latitudes, or in northern and southern hemisphere. So the stingless bees, they live close to their thermal edge of their physiological edge. And this is a problem if we look at forecasts of rising ambient temperature. This is a study from 2008, which studied several groups of invertebrate of ectotherms, among them the insects. And here you can see the impact of increasing ambient temperatures in association with their geographic distribution. So we have here in close to the equator, again, we have a huge negative impact on the activity or the survival of these insect species due to their thermal or the reduced warming tolerance. Okay, so future climatic changes, future global warming, which will have a huge negative impact on insects that live close to the equator in tropical regions. Okay, in more northern and southern environments, we don't have this negative impact. We might even expect a positive impact of climate warming, but it's another story which I will not enter too much in my talk today, because otherwise we will spend more than 2 or 3 hours talking about it. So how we can now study these impacts? So we know, or that there are studies that show that insects close to the equator in the tropics, they will be affected more by climate change, by increasing ambient temperatures than other insects. So how can we study these possible impacts of increasing ambient temperatures? One of the possibilities is going into a climate zone where there's really hot weather. Usually when people think about the tropics, they always think about these very green, huge tropical rainforests. But as Christoph said in his introduction, I studied I spent 10 years almost studying stingless bees in this kind of habitat. This is the Brazilian tropical dry forest. And this tropical dry forest is far from being this huge rainforest situation. As you can see, there are trees. Trees exist, but they are very rather small, rather open vegetation, and it's mostly dry during big parts of the year. So in this climate zone, which is in northeast of Brazil, we have just a second here. We have the tropical dry forests worldwide. So we have not only in Brazil, we have tropical dry forests. We have tropical dry forests in several parts of the world. So South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia as well. So these tropical dry forests, which are a huge part actually of the tropical ecosystem, which is 42% of tropical habitats are tropical dry forests. So it's the studies I did in the Brazilian tropical dry forests are not something very special. If you imagine that 42 or almost half of the tropical biomes are tropical dry forests, so it's not very special. But tropical dry forest, here's we have the Brazilian biomes. Here's the tropical dry forest in brown, which is called the Caatinga, as Christoph also said already in his introduction. It's a huge part of Brazil, not as big as the Amazon rainforest or the Atlantic rainforest, but it's a huge part in northeastern Brazil. And this tropical dry forest, it's characterized by high ambient temperatures. So we have, as you can see here on the average annual mean temperature, around 28 to 30 degrees in the hottest areas, which doesn't appear too much. I mean, if you say, okay, we have 28 degrees, it's not a cruel temperature. But you have to imagine that this 28 degrees, it's the annual average, and the temperatures do not change very much along the year. So we have a very stable thermal climate. Morning temperatures are around 20 to 25 degrees, and temperatures during the day, they go up to 40 degrees. So we have the variation, the daily variation is between 25 to 40 degrees in the shade. So it's not sun temperatures that we talk about. The second challenge for bees in this case is not only the temperature. The temperature is at this moment in current times not as critical, but forecasts say that the temperature will rise 4 degrees, and we will see that 4 degrees might cause severe problems. An increase in by 4 degrees might cause severe problems to the bees. The second bigger problem currently for social bees is the low precipitation. So we have regions where the annual precipitation stays below 400 millimeters. And since plants and the abundance of food sources for bees depend very much on the precipitation, on the rain, you can imagine that in this region, bees are they live in an environment where they have to look hard for food, and have only very short periods of the year where they can really use these food sources. These environmental conditions that we have in the tropical dry forest, which is both an higher ambient temperature than we have in the surrounding biomes, first of all. Second, the very dry climate, which we have a rain period in northeastern Brazil, which is between 2 to 3 months, where the bees have, or the plants have rainfall and produce their flowers, and 9 months without rain. So within these 2 months, 2 to 3 months, the bees social bees, they have to collect huge quantities of food so they can sort of survive the rest of the year. Okay, this is a big problem for social bees. Not as big as a problem for solitary bees, but for social bees, a problem because they need to maintain their colonies over 9 months without access to food sources. And that's the reason why we have rather few social bees in the Caatinga biome. So we have here in a map that I made for a publication, 2019. So we have 18 to 20 species of social bees, of stingless bees in this case, known in the Caatinga region, yeah, which is far lower than we have in the surrounding biomes. One of the species, and this is was my focus species for several years, is Jandaíra. That's the popular name. Melipona subnicita is the scientific name. Occurrence. This is a species which is native to the Caatinga region. Here you can see the distribution of these bees around in the darker shaded area is the Caatinga. So they occur not only in the Caatinga, so they are not endemic to the Caatinga, but they occur predominantly in the Caatinga region. So this is a bee which is very highly adapted to these climate conditions that we have in the Caatinga. Here's a nice picture, by the way. You can see that's the same spot in the forest, where you can see the difference between the dry season and the rainy season. So that the plants, all these plants, they produce a lot of leaves, logically, for survival, but also flowers for reproduction in a very short period. Well, switch to Portuguese. So you have to stop me if I suddenly switch to Portuguese. Sorry about that. In addition to these long drought periods, these long dry periods, we have also high environmental temperatures, as I said before. Okay. Here we have along the year, we have a rather stable average temperatures, which is around in this particular region where we studied the bees was around 28 to 30 degrees, but with very low variation along the year. But pay attention to the highest and lowest temperatures. Yeah? We have the temperatures rarely drop below 20 degrees. I think the lowest temperature I ever measured in our study region was 19 degrees Celsius. But they go up to around 40 degrees. And this in several months, at least 35 degrees to 40 degrees daily maximum temperatures in the shade, which is rather high for bees. Just another short excursion to bee physiology, insect physiology. 40 degrees, usually insects and bees, given that they are ectothermic, their body temperature is close to the ambient temperatures. As we'll see afterwards, the bees have even higher body temperatures than the ambient temperature. And 40 degrees, usually you say, okay, 40 degrees is a point of where proteins start to degrade. So it's a very 40 to 42 degrees, a very critical temperature for most of the living things, and among them the insects and bees. Here we have the temperatures in the sun, which is on the next point. We have very high solar radiation, given that we have, it's very nice to live there. I mean, you have blue sky almost all year round, but this causes a problem for the bees because we have a very high solar radiation, which even more close, it's rather close to the equator. So the solar radiation is really high. And this causes ambient temperatures in the sun, very high sun temperatures. So as you can see here, around 9 to 10 o'clock in the morning, we measured here the temperatures at a food plant on the canopy level where the flowers occur. So some of the plants, they really expose their flowers at canopy level so that they don't really hide them within. So the bees have to, here's one of these Jandaíra bees collecting at these flowers to show that they really go there. And at the canopy level, we have at 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, close to 50 degrees Celsius. So as I said before, 40 degrees is already a thermal critical threshold for most living things. and 50 degrees, so it's 10 degrees above that. So you can imagine that is a rather stressful thermal situation for forages. If you might imagine that even if bees start foraging early in the morning, they will still be active around 9-10 o'clock in the morning. So they will really be exposed to these high ambient temperatures. Okay, so these high ambient temperatures, they might lead or should lead to a rather severe overheating of the individuals. So what can the bees now do to avoid this overheating of their body? So first of all, they have to get up early. So as you have seen in the 2 slides before, morning temperatures are rather low, which is around 20 to 22 degrees Celsius. And when bees get up early, close to sunrise, so they will not have to cope with these high ambient temperatures. And that's what actually occur along the, here's another different study, which we published in 2015. Here you can see the onset of foraging, which is around 6 o'clock. Another month is even early in the morning, around 5 o'clock, depending on the sunrise. Actually, the sunrise is in this case, sunrise is the critical point where the bees really start foraging. So they start foraging at first light, and they have, as you can see here in the bar in the middle of this, or the line in the middle of these bars, shows the foraging peak, so where the most activity occurs. So you can see the highest activity occurs around 7 to 8, maximum 9 o'clock in the morning, sometimes even earlier. And they stop foraging around 11 maximum, sometimes stop foraging even around 6 o'clock in the morning. So they have, here you have this very nice group of colonies which started foraging at 5 o'clock and stopped foraging at 6 o'clock and peaked at 5:30. So you can imagine as researcher, you have to get up rather early in the morning, get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get to your bee colonies, to see them start foraging. And if you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, you get there too late, you will never see the bees foraging. So the bees get up very early and stop very early in their foraging activity. And this, the pollen foraging, or the foraging itself, it's not associated with the conditions within the colony. This is another study we published in 2016, showing that the foraging activity, it's not associated with storage of the colonies. It's rather associated with the availability of food sources in the environment. Okay, so it's as soon as there are food sources available, the bees start foraging, or the bees forage, and when the food sources become scarce, the bees stop their foraging activity. We have 2 groups, pollen forages and nectar forages. So the pollen forages, this is the gray bars, they start foraging early in the morning and at lower ambient temperatures than nectar forages. Okay, nectar forages, they are capable of foraging at to 35 degrees Celsius. This is a shade temperature, by the way, so it's not the 50 degrees sun temperature, but this is the 35 degrees shade temperature. And as you have seen, most of the year we have these 35 to 40 degrees Celsius as daily maximum temperature. Pollen forages, they are not as tolerant to temperatures. They stop foraging far earlier and at far lower ambient temperatures. So they have their maximum activity at around 25 degrees Celsius, and at 30 degrees they're abandon foraging. So why are nectar forages able to forage? Why are they able to forage at higher air temperatures than pollen forages? So why do that? Do they do that? Or how do they do it? One of the things we looked at was if an increased exposure to ambient temperatures, if this causes some physiological problems to the bees, leading to their thermal death. And so one of the strategies that bees have to use, they shouldn't stay out too long from their home. Why is that? This is a study by Jorgensen from 2019, a study on Drosophila, which shows that the injuries, the physiological injuries that occur at elevated temperatures, they accumulate over time. So if an animal is exposed to these higher temperatures, which leads to physiological injuries, for a longer time, they will die. So they have to try to, in case of stressful temperatures, they have to try to stay out of their hive, out of their nest for shorter times to avoid these thermal injuries. And this was what actually happens, at least in pollen forages. Here in pollen forages, in a study was published last year, you can see that the pollen forages, they stay out longer in lower ambient temperatures. And as soon as ambient temperatures go up to 30 degrees, the pollen foraging, the trip duration becomes much shorter. So apparently the bees really follow this rule to not to stay out too long and return to their home in case the temperature gets too high. And here another interesting point, which we'll discuss a little bit further. You can see here this 30 degrees Celsius, and I said before 40 degrees is a critical threshold for most living things. So why is this 30 degrees? We'll talk about this in a little bit. But just to keep this in mind, these 30 degrees are air temperatures in the shade, okay? The nectar forages, interestingly, are not as affected by ambient temperatures than are pollen forages. So this association with between trip duration and air temperature, this is associated primarily with the pollen forages and not with the nectar forages. So why are nectar forages influenced less by heat stress than our pollen forages? This is the same study where we did some physiological experiments, stressing bees in incubators with elevated temperatures. And here you can see the mortality rates of 3 groups. Here a group exposed 6 minutes to certain temperatures, 20 minutes or 60 minutes. And this was a group which had received nectar or sugar syrup as food during a 1 hour acclimation period. And this group was a group which has not received this sugar syrup during this acclimation period. So we had 1 hour where the bees were acclimated in an incubator at 28 degrees. One group received sugar syrup, the others didn't. So one had access to liquid food and this group had not. What we can see here is now two very interesting things. First of all, what I already said before, that short exposure times, so if bees are exposed for short times, they tolerate very high temperatures. So you can see here that these groups exposed for 6 minutes, that they have critical temperatures and lethal critical temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius and lethal temperatures close to 55 degrees Celsius. So it's a very high temperature, but this is only in case that they don't stay out very long, okay? If they stay out for 20 minutes, or if they're exposed to high temperatures for 20 minutes, what do we see? The lethal temperatures are far lower, so they can't support as high as temperatures as when they stay out short time, and even more or even less so in 60 minutes. So if a bee forages for 1 hour, this bee can tolerate only between 40 to 45 degrees Celsius. And so this is the first thing that we can see here from this graph. The second thing that we can see is that the access to liquid food increases the thermal tolerance of the bees. So not in this very short exposure time, but if we look at these 20 minutes or 60 minutes exposure time, we can see that if we look only at the lethal temperature here, when bees have access to liquid food, they tolerate 45 degrees, and without access to liquid food, that they tolerate only 42 degrees. So the access to liquid food, which is in case of nectar forages, when they go out foraging, they have access to liquid food given that they look for this food, they collect this food. So this access to liquid food makes them more tolerant to higher ambient temperatures. So that's one of the possibilities or possible explanations of why pollen forages are more affected by high ambient temperatures than our nectar forages. Another strategy of bees, they shouldn't, so as you have seen in the last block, they shouldn't stay out very long. Associated with this is that they shouldn't go too far. I mean, if you stay out for only 6 to 10 to 20 minutes, you can't forage at very far distances. And we looked at this in a different study where we had 3 food sources. We trained the bees to food sources at 15 meters, 50 and 100 meters. And we made some thermographic recordings of the body temperatures. We compared head, thorax, and abdomen temperature at these different food source distances. And what you can see here, what I already said before that I will talk about a bit later, is that bees have, when they are foraging, that they have higher body temperatures than the ambient temperature. Here we have the line which would indicate the ambient temperature, and you can see that thorax temperatures are far higher than are the ambient temperatures. Why is that? That's because of the activity of the flight muscles. So bees, for flying, they need to move their wings, and the wings are attached to the flight muscles. And the wing beat frequency is around 150 to 200 hertz, which is 200 times a second the bees have to flap their wings, which is a very high activity. So this high activity, this high muscular activity causes an increase in thoracic temperature primarily. Okay, so we have elevated temperatures or body temperatures above ambient temperature. So now if you remember now the 30 degrees that I told you that the bees pollen forages return at 30 degrees. If we have this 30 degrees ambient temperature, we have already around 40 degrees thorax temperature in these bees. Okay, so it's this increase in body temperature due to the flight muscle activity makes that bees are far hotter than is their environment. So what do the bees now do with this heat? So they have an elevated heat production due to flight activity. So what do they do with the heat? One of the strategies that many bees have, actually, it's not a specialty now for stingless bees, is that they shunt part of the heat to the head and the abdomen. Here you can see, in case that the curve decreases, this means that the bees cool down at a certain part of their body. So here you can see at 15 meters, the bees cool down their head, which is where evaporation occurs primarily during foraging, is the head and the abdomen. So we can expect that evaporative cooling occurs primarily at these regions. And here you can see that at ambient, here we have the air temperatures, not the body temperatures, but the air temperatures. You can see that at air temperatures above 30 degrees, we have evaporative cooling at these points. So the bees, they transfer heat from their thorax to their head and their abdomen. And at these points, the heat is dissipated and they cool down. But this works only at short distances. It works at 15 meters. It works a little bit still, at least at the abdomen, or at least at the head, sorry, at 50 meters, but it doesn't work anymore at 100 meters. At 100 meters, if you imagine honeybees, which go up to 4 kilometers, 100 meters foraging distance, a very short distance for bees. So at distances beyond 50 meters, we have a successive overheating of the system, given that the bees, even if they transfer heat from the thorax to their head and their abdomen, they cannot anymore dissipate the heat sufficiently to cool down these body regions. So what occurs primarily at very high solar radiation, and these are solar radiations that occur in the Caatinga and the Caatinga Brazilian tropical dry forest region at around 9 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, where you have already this very high solar radiation. What you have is that we have a heat gain. So a very tricky graph, because the bars, if they go down, you have a heat gain. If they go up, you have a heat loss, actually. But then anyway, at 100 meters, you have a heat gain of the bees. Even at lower solar radiations, and at high solar radiation, we have a heat gain even at short distances. Okay, so the heat dissipation, this mechanism that I explained before, it is effective at lower solar radiation at short distances, and it becomes increasingly ineffective as solar radiation increases first, and second, as food source distances increases. Okay. So we have heat gain. We have every time a bee goes out of its nest, it has some form of heat gain, given that they are exposed to solar radiation, exposed to other forms of radiation, and produce their own heat due to flight muscle movement. So I think I will talk a bit longer than 45 minutes. Sorry about that. So they have a heat gain at the thorax. This heat is dissipated to the head and the abdomen, where they can cool down. They manage to cool it down. At 50 meters, the bees cannot anymore cool down the head, and they have an increasing temperature even at the abdomen. And at 100 meters, or distances beyond 50 meters, they have increasing heat at both the abdomen and the head. This increasing temperature primarily at the head is critical, given that the head carries the brain, and brain overheating is not very nice for the bees. Okay, next point. Oops, sorry. So we have now this a little bit of a physiological view what the bees, or how the bees cope with higher ambient temperatures, and what they have to do to avoid overheating. So they have to stay. They shouldn't stay out too long, and they shouldn't go too far from the nest, and they have to get up early. So that's the three main messages. What occurs now with the foraging dynamics in increasing ambient temperatures? That was one of our questions as well. This study hasn't been published yet. We stress the bees a little bit more. So you have seen that the tropical dry forest climatic situation is already rather stressful, but you can stress the bees even more if you put the nest boxes in plain sunlight instead of some very nice shaded treatments. So we had two treatments, one sunlit treatment and one shade treatment. The shade treatment is in blue, the sunlit treatment you have here in yellow. So what we could see, for which was rather clear, nest temperatures increased with ambient temperatures. So since stingless bees, they don't have a very efficient cooling mechanism as efficient as we know from honeybees. The nest temperatures increase as soon as ambient temperatures increase, okay? So within the nest, the temperatures increase with increasing ambient temperature. And what was the result of this increasing nest temperature? Sorry, the result of this increasing nest temperature was a reduction in pollen foraging. As you can see, in both groups, the shaded group and the sunlit group, they have had a reduced pollen foraging at higher ambient temperatures or nest temperatures than at low nest temperatures. So the proportion of pollen forages in comparison to the total amount of forages. What is interesting about that? So we can see now, okay, higher ambient temperatures and concomitantly higher nest temperatures leads to a reduced pollen foraging, maybe due to the fact that bees need to concentrate more on liquid foods and the intake of water to provide at least some cooling. The stingless bees, as I said, they don't have efficient cooling mechanisms, but they collect water and connect higher liquid nectar with less sugar to at least to do some cooling. Okay, so this increase or this decrease in pollen foraging might be associated with an increase in nectar foraging and water foraging, actually. But this is a problem for bee colonies. As you might know, bees need to maintain their colonies. They need primarily the pollen. Pollen is important for the brood, so that the brood can grow. As soon as you reduce the pollen intake into the colony, you will reduce the possibility of these colonies to produce new brood. Okay, and this is now the problem of the increasing ambient temperatures due to climate warming. If we think, okay, at the moment the bees work fine, but if we have an increase in only 4 degrees Celsius from 30 to 34 degrees, this will result in a huge decrease in pollen foraging in the colonies, which will result in a problem of maintaining these colonies and lead eventually to colony death. Here you can see the brood cell construction, which is associated with this reduced pollen intake. So in both groups as well, you can see that the brood cell construction was reduced as nest temperatures goes up, which might be associated with the reduced pollen foraging. So which is also all in some forms connected. Okay, so you have, with higher ambient temperatures and higher nest temperatures, you have a reduced pollen intake into the colonies, and due to this higher pollen intake, you have a reduced brood cell construction, which might lead to colony death if this brood cell construction, this reduced brood cell construction goes on. Now, the last point of my talk is about a little bit about competition. And this is a study I did several years ago. I never managed to publish it because I always gave preference to other studies, but I really want to publish this paper. It's a nice study. We looked at how changes in ambient temperatures might influence the competition among social bees, so between different species of social bees. And we used a very nice system here in state of São Paulo and other states as well. We have this, I think they call Brazilian cherry, pitanga is the Brazilian name, Eugenia uniflora, Mambertacea. Which is a very mass blooming species, so it produces a lot of flowers for a short period within the year, and Interestingly, they produce it during winter time, which is nice because there are few flowers around, and there you suddenly have these mass flowering plants, which is very nice because all bees in the surrounding, they go there. So in these mass flowering plants, you have a huge concentration of social bees. So we have where you can find apis, which can introduce species in Brazil. But we can find also find native species. Some 3 species here of stingless bees, and here we have a bumblebee species. We have a few bumblebee species as well in the tropics. Here, one of these bumblebee species that we have here. So these mass flowering trees, they attract a huge amount of forages, and we observe the foraging of 2 species, which is Melipona quadrifasciata, this one here, and Scaptodigona tepilis, which is this one here. So we have a big species and a rather small species, and we compared their foraging at these, or the foraging activity, not necessarily at these plants, but the foraging activity during these mass flowering events. And we asked if increasing temperatures influence the daily foraging schedule of these 2 bee species to different extents, and if increasing temperatures might lead to an increasing overlap at common food sources. What we found out, so we studied these in 2 years. One was the cooler year, and the other one I will call now the warmer year. So we have one where the ambient temperatures were lower than the other year. And in the cooler year, both bee species that started foraging a little bit later in the day. So we have the dawn and the sunrise time during the study period. So you can see that the bigger species here in green, they start foraging at dawn. So as soon as light is, or even before dawn here, as soon as light is available, or even before, the bees can go out foraging, are capable of going out foraging. But since in this cooler year, and it was winter time in São Paulo, so we had around 5 to 10 degrees in the morning, which is a rather low temperatures for stingless bees. So they started foraging at around 6:30 and stopped foraging at around 10 o'clock. The small species, as you can see here in red, they started foraging far later. So around 8:30 to 9 o'clock in the morning, they started foraging. Okay, this is in the cooler year. In the warmer year, the bigger species, they couldn't shift their foraging, their onset of foraging too much, given that they are restricted by light conditions. Yet they started foraging a little bit earlier due to ambient temperature, but the restriction here in this case will be the light conditions. So they cannot go out foraging until there's sufficient light so they can perform their activities. The small species, on the other hand, they started foraging far earlier in the morning, around 7:30 in the warmer year than in the colder year. So bigger species, they were a little affected, the foraging activity were less affected, let's say it like that, less affected by increasing ambient temperatures. Yet the smaller species, they were far more affected. So they started foraging far early in the morning than in the cooler year. And this might now cause a problem for competition at food sources, because we have the one species, the bigger species, which have usually a scramble competition mechanism. They go to the food sources, and as soon as better competitors, stronger competitors arrive at these food sources, they have already collected all what they need. And this small species, this Scaptodigona species, just going back, this species here has mass recruitment. So this species doesn't recruit, they recruit, but they don't have this recruitment in huge masses. And this species, they mass recruit bees from the colony to food sources or to other sources as well. So in short time, you have a huge buildup of small bees at the food source, which might cause a problem now for the bigger bees, which cannot defend themselves against this. Well, they don't actually interact aggressively, but the sheer presence of a huge amount of small bees makes these bees abandon the food sources. We looked at the food source overlap between the 2 years, and you can see that in the cool year, where we have the farther distance of the foraging activity, we have less food source overlap between the species than we have in the cooler year, in the warmer year, sorry. So in the warmer year, the bees collect far more similar food sources than in the cooler year. And this is interesting if you think, okay, the bees now they collect at the same food in the cool year. They separate kind of separate the food sources. The bigger species collect at a certain set of food sources, and the smaller species at a different set of food sources. Now, even in the warmer year, given that the foraging activity of the smaller species is anticipated earlier, they can go to the same food sources as to the big species. So there will be more competition about this over these food sources. So here is a graphic, like a cartoon. So we have in the cool year, we have high profit. I named these the high profit, the low profit food sources. What occurs in the cool year, that the high profit food source and low profit food sources, they bloom, they produce flowers at the same time. Big bees go out earlier, arrive at the food sources early. So what they can do, they can easily go to the high profit food sources, exploit these high profit food sources as much as possible, and the smaller species which go out later in the morning, they won't have access to this high profit food source anymore, given that the bigger species already exploited everything. So they will be located to the low profit food sources. So what occurs now in warmer years, that bees, bigger bees go out a little bit earlier, will arrive a little bit earlier at the high profit food sources, yet the smaller species, and even more so the mass recruiting species, in case they arrive simultaneously at these high profit food sources, what will occur is that the big species, they will abandon this food source and will now have to look for lower profit food sources in the surroundings. So what occurs is that the bigger species, they are kind of expelled from the high profit food sources and go to low profit food sources in warmer years. So it's an advantage. Warmer years are an advantage for the small species, but a disadvantage for the bigger species. And so the weaker competitors, given that they don't have this mass recruitment, they are the weaker competitors. They cannot arrive at food sources in such a high amount. They will be excluded from important high profit food sources. And again, if bees that need these high profit food sources, I call them high profit because they produce a lot of pollen in short time, so the bees can really collect as much as possible from these food sources. And when they are excluded from these food sources, they will have to go to to less profit food sources, which will consequently cause will have a negative impact on brood production and on colony maintenance. But we don't have to worry. As one of our main climate experts said a couple of years ago, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese. So you don't have to worry, there won't be any climate change. Bees don't have to worry. And everything that I told you and that I studied is, you can keep it, but it's not true. Okay, thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Michael, for presenting these very interesting results. Do we have any questions? Yes, Vidur has a question.
Go ahead.
So considering the need to be close to resources to like minimize commute time, these Melipona submitted bees, are they, and I guess also stingless bees in this area in general, do they tend to readily relocate their nest site, not migrate, but relocate their nest site in response to like fluctuating resources?
Thank you, Vidur, for this question. A very interesting question. Stingless bees, they, in comparison with honeybees, stingless bees are not capable of relocating their nests quickly. They have a rather long process of nest founding. So we don't have migration processes, but we have processes where bees abandon a certain area and will migrate to or found their nests, try to found their nests at a new site. And this nest founding is usually at distances between 100 and 200 meters. So they can't go very quickly to a new environment. So once they are stuck in this environment, it will take some time to get to a new environment with better environmental conditions. And this is a very critical point if you think about the deforestation and the reduction of the natural habitat. So once you reduce the natural habitat of bees, of stingless bees, they will take very long to get to better foraging and ecological sites for in general. So they don't, unfortunately for them, they do not have these swarming and migration processes that we know from honeybees. But a very good question. Thank you. Did I answer your question, Vidur?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, then we have a question by Salvatore.
Yes, thank you very much for your nice talk. And my question is, I would be interesting to know how generalizes these attitudes among different pollinator species of being more resistant to higher temperature when they feed on nectar compared to pollen.
I guess I'm not really 100% sure, but physiologically, I guess that this will be the same. This is simply a fact of nectar forages having access to liquids, because the pollen or animals in general, they need water for evaporative cooling. So they use the water, evaporate the water, and cool down. So as soon as they have access to some liquids, they can use these liquids to provide this evaporative cooling. In pollen forages, which do not have access to liquid food during their foraging, some of them take nectar with them from the colonies. So they have some reserves, some liquid reserves that they can use during foraging for evaporative cooling. But usually they heat up far more than the nectar forages. And I think this is I'm not sure whether there are a lot of studies on this point, but I'm pretty sure that this should be the same in all, at least insect pollinator species, so that the nectar forages or the nectar collectors are more tolerant to higher temperatures than there are the pollen forages. It's a simple, more of a physiological fact that gives me the idea, but really I don't think there are too many studies on that actually. But I guess it's more a general fact. Did I answer your question, Salvatore?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Martin.
Then we have a question by Martin.
Wait, just a second. Hi, Michael. Great to see
Hi,
you.
Martin. Great to see you. Very
Nice
nice.
to see you, Christopher and Axel and all the others. It's, I mean, a unique opportunity to be here. I mean, it's fascinating findings you're reporting here. And I was just thinking about an additional factor that could somehow play a role in this difference between nectar and pollen resistance to temperature, because somehow you're considering that correctly from the physiological point of view, but there might be an extra, say, adaptive factor. And I don't know if you had a look at that. I mean, proteins tend to denature at higher temperatures, and by higher we understand, if I'm not wrong, around 40 or 50 degrees, which is exactly the temperatures where you see this decline in pollen foragers. By denature, we mean that they unfold. They are not necessarily lost in their normal structure, but they are unfold. And that might also happen to pollen. I don't know to what extent this could be the case. First question, do we know if pollen, say, denatures, unfold in terms of protein context at these temperatures? And does it have an effect, for instance, on the preference also of the bees, saying, well, this is bad quality food or things like that? Do you have any idea about that?
It's a very interesting point. I really haven't thought about that at all so far. So it's a very interesting point. But I mean, if we studied one bee species, and there were other bee species around that didn't stop pollen foraging that early. So from the comparative point of view, there are other bee species that still collect pollen when the others stop. So probably the pollen it could be affected actually, but maybe not as much as the bees, given that the pollen, well, this is a very tricky question actually, because it depends very much on where the flowers are. I mean, if they are in full sunlight, then the probability that the pollen might be affected by the temperature is rather high. But I really don't know any studies that looked at that so far. But maybe they exist, but I really haven't thought about it so far. But a very good question, very good question. And yeah, from the comparative point of view, I mean, we have pollen foraging of other bee species still out, even if the other bee species already stopped. So, but they might forage a different pollen plant. So we would need to look at that more in more detail, which pollen was collected by which bees, to see if there might be it. As you said, it is possible. I think it's really possible, but I haven't thought about that so far.
So, for instance, just to finish the idea, if you would do, say, a choice experiment in which you would provide pollen that has been heated to these temperatures, it's no longer actually warm or whatever, but it has been heated, it went through this process, and pollen that didn't go through this process. Question would be whether bees exhibit a preference in terms of unfolded protein versus normal protein state. Just to know if we are able to see the difference.
To perceive that, a good point for future experiments, Martin.
Exactly. Thanks. In any case,
I keep you informed if it's worked out. Okay. A nice idea. Good idea.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we have a couple of questions in the chat as well, Axel.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a question by Tegan Gaetano. Do you see nest fanning behavior in stingless bees, Michael?
Yes, it depends on the stingless bee species. We don't see them in all bee species, but these bee species that we studied in Northeast Brazil, they show nest fanning. Other bee species in São Paulo state, we already observed as well this nest fanning behavior, but we don't have it in all stingless bee species. Some of the stingless bee species they have a very different behavior. Some of them, when they live below ground, for example, the bees just shut down their entrance tube and hide within the nest. So not all of the bee species have this fanning behavior, but it exists.
Okay, then there's a question by Inda Putri Janua Justia. Two questions. How do you determine between stingless bees that collect water and nectar to the nest?
Oh, this is we squeeze them. We squeeze them and collect what they regurgitate. So stingless bees, they have a big advantage. They don't have a stinger. So you take the bees between your fingers and squeeze them, and they will produce what they have collected in between their mouth parts, and you collect it with a glass pipette, and then you can measure the sugar amount within this liquid that they regurgitate. And by definition, if it's below 5% of sugar, we define it as water. Above that, we define it as nectar.
Okay, thank you. That was clear. Second, does the overheating also affect the activity to collect resin?
Good question. Good question. I'm not sure about this. We did some studies on. We looked at this resin collecting behavior, but not associated now with increasing temperatures. But I guess I can look through this data again to see if the students, if they collected this resin collection data. But I guess it might be affected as well, because given that the bees this reduction in pollen foraging is mostly associated with an increase in nectar and water foraging. So if the colonies, they concentrate their foraging activity to water and nectar foraging, they reduce all the other things that they collect, which is pollen, which is feces, which is mud and resin as well.
Okay, then there's a question by Anthony Antonucci. Do high temperatures have an impact on brood production? And is it caused by less food? More workers needed for foraging or other issues? Thank you. Okay, that was
Okay.
You got it. Yeah, I mean, I pronounced it.
No, I have the chat here on my screen, so I can follow it. High temperatures have an impact on brood production. Yes, in different ways. Okay. One way that I showed here is there's a reduction in pollen intake, and in stingless bees have a different system of food provisioning their brood. So they provide pollen and nectar mixture they put it into the brood cell. The queen lays the egg and the bees close this cell, and the cell stays closed until the emergence of the adult bee. So they don't have a progressive feeding of the larvae. Okay, so the pollen inside the colony, when there's a lot of pollen stored inside the colony, the workers can provide enough pollen for the brood. If there is no pollen inside the colony, or reduced pollen inside the colony, there is no pollen that the bees can use to produce these new brood cells, or to provide food to these new brood cells. So there's a different study that I didn't show here, but we have a very clear association between pollen storage and brood production. So as soon as we reduce the pollen storage, then we have an interruption in brood, or a high reduction in brood production. Okay, so this is the first association. So if we have a reduction in pollen intake with increasing ambient temperatures, we will have a reduced brood production because of this. Second, we have a reduced brood production. This is another part that I did not show. Given that the queens are affected very much by elevated temperatures. It's a very interesting study that started it a couple of years ago. It was kind of interrupted due to my change in geographic change in Brazil, but we are continuing it. At the moment we looked at the sperm viability in the spermatheca of the queens exposed to 30, 32, and 34 degrees Celsius. Okay, if you know from honeybee research, 34 to 36 degrees Celsius is the common brood temperature. In stingless bees, we have a common brood temperatures of between 28 to 30 degrees Celsius.
Oh.
And the queens exposed to 34 degrees Celsius for 24 hours, the sperm viability decreased, dropped almost to zero. So what's the result of this? The queens in 34 degrees Celsius for 24 hours, which is not, it's a long time, but it's not as long as the time as if you consider the lifetime of a queen. So they don't have any sperm available to fertilize the eggs. In other words, all the eggs that the queen will lay in the future will be males. And this is, of course, also a problem. Maybe not the brood production as such, but the production of new workers will be influenced greatly. And this is what I said before, during my talk. This increase in 4 degrees by 4 degrees Celsius that is forecasted for Northeast Brazil. Since stingless bees are not very capable of regulating their temperatures, if we have an increase by 4 degrees, the brood temperature will increase by 4 degrees, and this will cause a tremendous problem, as I did not show here, but I told you just now, primarily for the queens, which won't be able to produce workers anymore. So it's a big problem for, at least for this stingless bee species. Okay.
Maybe so. Anthony kind of raised his hand. Maybe he wants to add something to the question.
Yeah, thanks. Great answer. I learned a lot just in the answer about the stingless bees. But I have a question on the high temperatures. Are they just seasonal high temperatures, or are they? Do you think they're results of climate change where temperatures are increasing? And if they're going to be extended periods of these high temperatures, what impact on the phenology between both the bees and their sources of nectar and pollen, where the plants will alter their, when they provide nectar and pollen to the species. And so is that something that is inevitable in the future?
Well, there are two things, Anthony, that for once there is certainly this climate change, this global warming going on, which is not necessarily always a stable increase all year round in ambient temperature.
Right.
But what we see here in São Paulo state, we have this very prominent heat waves. We call them heat waves because it's a sudden increase in ambient temperature, which is not has nothing to do with the season of the year. For example, last winter, which is winter temperatures here in São Paulo state, we have, it's cold here, so we have around 15 to 20 degrees. Okay, and suddenly, all of a sudden, temperatures rose to 40 degrees, and it stayed for 40 degrees for 2 weeks, and then they dropped again to the 15 to 20. So we have these heat waves, which suddenly impact all the environment. Which have to do with climate change. The wise people say that have to. I don't study climate change, so I just take what I see from literature. But apparently, these heat waves have to do with it. So if we think only about these heat waves, this might certainly as well have a problem for plants, but not necessarily will have to will change plant phenology. But there's the second part of climate change, which is an increase in annual annual average temperatures, which several studies also suggest that this increase in ambient temperature might lead to mismatches between plants or plants producing their flowers and activity of pollinators. This is maybe not as dramatic in social bees, since they are available all year round. Even more so in the tropics, where they don't really have these prominent phases of where they are not active. In the Northeast Brazil, we have some months where the bees are not active because it's simply too dry to produce flowers. But not all plants are pollinated by social bees. So there will be, for several plants and several pollinators, this increase in annual mean temperatures will cause this phenological mismatch, as you said, Anthony. Did I answer your question?
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Michael, so there's a comment by Christian Perk. The pollen grain should be protected by the exine from these temperatures. I mean, at least kind of suggesting that, I mean, the plants that need the pollen to be working should do something about it. And then there's a question by Nagaraja. Is there any correlation between foraging load and carrying capacity and temperature? Of foraging load, carrying capacity and temperature?
I didn't study that so far. Okay. I think there are studies on that in stingless bees, but I'm not sure about the results now. But if we think that the bees, I mean, the bees collect usually as much pollen as they are capable to carry, and I'm not. There might be an indirect link due to maybe shifts in body size, because if we have higher ambient temperatures in the brood area, what is going to occur is that the brood will accelerate their development, and will produce smaller, will emerge earlier and will produce smaller adults. And the smaller adults maybe won't be able to carry as much pollen as our bigger adults. So there might be an indirect link, but a direct link I do not see. I'm not sure. I think there is some study on that, but I really don't remember it at this moment. Sorry.
Okay, Michael, I'm not sure whether the question was in that direction. I mean, maybe you understood too literally, because so maybe the question was more, but I don't know, I guess. So whether I kind of like the pollen collected with time and with temperature, whether that goes also down. Do you understand? When you show that pollen foraging trips get shorter, right?
Okay. So they.
Then one would
sure.
also expect that probably the pollen load.
The pollen load reduces.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe kind of like maybe that's.
Yeah. If in case the question goes in that direction, there is no study on that. I'm pretty sure about that. We did some. We did some measuring of the pollen loads in this last experiment that I showed you about the competition over time. So bees at different points of the day, so in the early in the morning and late in the morning when they stopped foraging, and we measured the pollen loads. but I don't remember any significant differences between the pollen size or the mass of the pollen load in the beginning of foraging and the end of foraging. So even if the bees stay out shorter, maybe they stick closer to the colony and collect the same amount of pollen. I don't remember now that there was a significant. I will have to look at the data again. It's a study a long couple of years ago already. I will look at the data, but it's a very interesting point actually. I will look at that. Thanks.
Okay, good. I mean, then I go back to Christoph, who has raised his hand, and then first Christoph and then Vidor.
So you've shown that the heat is especially difficult for the pollen foragers. And I was wondering if it could be a solution for a bee to become more of a generalist. So instead of collecting only pollen, to mix it up with nectar as well. And I was just wondering, do you have any indication that with an increase in temperature, maybe you have a less strict division of labor between pollen and nectar foraging?
In our case, and the study case in Melipona subniche, we did not find it. We had a very strict separation in pollen forages and nectar forages, but this might be more a restriction of the plants available, because we have either nectar plants or pollen plants and not nectar and pollen. Because I think once we have nectar and pollen plants, it might be possible that the bees do both. As far as we have seen so far, that the bees they are quite they stick to one of these food sources once they started collecting it. We didn't see that effect. It might be, but it might be that in this case it's a very environmental restriction due to lack of these food sources. Because there are far more pollen sources around us than nectar sources. So I was thinking if they go to a pollen source and then they have to fly to the next nectar source, if this does not increase the thermal challenge instead of reducing it. So
I see.
Yeah, but then an interesting idea. It could be. It's worth looking at it.
Okay.
Vidor.
So yeah, first of all, this first thing is not so much of a question. It's like an idea, which is that perhaps like the load carrying capacity could, as a function of temperature, could be determined with like weight gain examination.
Mm-hmm. Could be done. It's an interesting point. So really this pollen carrying capacity or the pollen foraging association with increasing temperatures, this is a point that we still have to look further into, and a very good input, Vidor. Thank you. I think
now my questions.
There are several questions here in the chat.
It's basically one big question in the chat. So basically wondering whether the queens mate once in their life, because if they mate just once, then once the like high temperature kills the sperm, that's it, right? And then is there any evidence that they might potentially like do kind of like inbreeding with their own male offspring if their sperm die?
So in Stingless bees, the queens, they mate only once as well. I see. There are some references, new references that show that some stingless bees mate more than once, but it's most stingless bees, let's take like that, most stingless bees that have been studied with respect to mating, they mate only once and with only one male. The male, well, when mating, it leaves a genital plug in the queen, so the queen cannot mate again So once the sperm is dead due to high temperatures, the queen cannot mate again. Okay, it's physiological, incapable of mating again. So once the sperm is lost, the sperm is lost. So inbreeding might not work as well in this case. But interesting question, Vidre. Thank you.
Axel.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Michael, kind of the whole talk, I was thinking about Apis dorsata, and kind of Apis dorsata, for example, you find them a lot on water pools, so they need a lot of water, and we haven't kind of tested whether they are going for low sugar concentrated flowers. So Apis dorsata kind of preferentially flies during twilight, the morning and the evening twilight. And I wanted to ask you, and I might have missed it. So you have focused so much on the morning twilight. So is it with your stingless bees that they don't fly in the evening twilight?
They have some of them with stingless bees is such a huge group. It's very difficult to say anything more generalistic. In the northeastern stingless bee that we looked at, Melipona subnicida, they had a very most of the year they didn't have a second foraging peak. That's just foraged in the morning and never left the hive again. In some months, and this was where primarily the cooler months of the year, they had a second foraging. They left the colony as well in the late afternoon, but they stopped foraging before it became too dark. So it's in contrast to Apis dorsata, the stingless bees, they don't have this really twilight some stingless bees, they do forage at twilight, like the Melipona quadrifasciata, which really goes out. When I came there as researcher, I didn't really see anything, and as a student that the bees already came back from foraging, so they have this twilight foraging capacity. The stingless bees in the northeast, not. They don't really forage at twilight. They really wait for the first sunrise, for the sun to rise, and in the evening as well, the sun goes down and the bees already are inside their nest. So they really don't forage at twilight in this case. Okay. I
wanted so my question was more like, because probably in the morning hours are probably colder than the twilight and sunset hours in the evening, right?
Correct.
Okay, so actually I have to admit that kind of like we have data about the foraging activity, but the data have never been analyzed whether there was a difference between morning twilight and evening twilight. So although they can fly, and most of the year, because the temperatures are not so super high in Bangalore, they're about 30 degrees, there might be even also then maybe a preference then even also go to be more active in the morning twilight. I have to check that. That's interesting phenomenon.
I guess, I mean, it depends very much on what they collect. I think the nectar forages, they might be active both in the morning and in the evening. What we saw in Melipona subnicida, pollen forages active only in the morning, and nectar forages, in case we had a second foraging activity in the later afternoon, it was only nectar foraging.
So that was also an idea I got from your talk, to kind of look whether there's a time difference between pollen and nectar forages. I mean, we have never looked at that.
Usually there is. It's more. This is also has to do with pollen production, pollen availability, because the plants, they do not reproduce pollen. The flowers do not provide new pollen during the day. They produce pollen once and that's it. But nectar, on the other hand, nectar, the flowers are capable of producing all day long. So I see that they also have their peaks in production. So some of them produce nectar earlier, some produce them later in the day. But usually nectar flowers are capable of producing nectar all day long. So, and that's why pollen foraging is usually restrained more to the morning hours, because you have all this competition about the pollen, and all bees go collecting pollen and compete over it. And when the pollen is gone, then they may concentrate on nectar foraging. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's a good idea. But I didn't know that.
I have a question. Maybe I've asked this in the past when you gave a talk. So
yeah, maybe.
You mentioned that honeybees are very good at thermoregulation, at maintaining a certain temperature, and stingless bees seem to be much less good at that. And they're also restricted to the tropics. So they had tens of millions of years time to develop methods of temperature control. So why don't we see better temperature control, either for extremely hot or for colder temperatures in stingless bees? I mean, do you have any idea why they're so restricted in this?
I really don't have any idea at all. I'm wondering this as well, because we have some stingless bees that have a very nice temperature control, which is the Trigonospinipes, which is a very abundant species, which have outside nests, and they are capable of controlling the nest temperatures far better than other bees. But these bees as well, I mean, they occur in South America, almost most of South America. You can find the Trigonospinipes, but they cannot go out of South America. So maybe there are some other restrictions that we don't know that are beyond this temperature capability. Another thing that we started studying several years ago, but I stopped foraging because I went to a different place, was the energetic needs associated with thermoregulation. And stingless bees, they have a rather low, comparison with honeybees, a rather low brood temperature, which is also a paradox. I mean, you live in the tropics where it's hot, so you have a lower brood temperature than bees that live in the temperate zone. And this is also one of the reasons why Apis is so successful, because they have this high ambient, which is a very nice comparison with our body temperature. I mean, they have this 36 degrees, which is a very ideal. They can accelerate their brood production by that, and have these huge colonies. The stingless bees, they have a lower brood temperature, and so they don't spend too much energy in both in heating, first of all, and second, in the tropical regions. When we investigated nest temperatures in natural nests, they are or even within, we looked at temperatures within nests and within trees where nests occurred, and the temperatures really at that time when we made our studies, they really didn't go beyond 28 degrees. So even in sunlit places, the tree barks are usually a good thermal isolator for the bees. So the bees, they don't have to spend too much energy, invest too much energy in thermoregulation, given that their environment already provides maybe sufficient thermoregulation, and associated to a small colony size. Most of the stingless bees also don't have this need of producing huge colonies. The huge colony, it's an interesting point, because I will have to study the huge colonies, which the Trigono species, Capacitor species, which have huge colonies, and I expect that they might be better at thermoregulating, because they need to maintain a higher brood temperature to manage to have as much bees in short time. but I really don't know. I don't know a perfect answer for that.
So it remains somewhat a mystery.
It remains a mystery still to me, at least.
Christoph and Martin, Michael, can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
But maybe that's off. I mean, so I mean, Michael was a little bit referring to it. I mean, in Würzburg, I was involved in this study, which showed that probably or evidence that the temperature regulation has an effect on the timing of the development of the brood. So if you have a constant high temperature environment, the brood can develop faster. And kind of like how to say, so then the question might be, why kind of like do honeybees need fast development of brood? And then kind of like how to say, you might maybe say that maybe it has something to do with swarming. So because for swarming, you need kind of like an increase in the colony density, in the number of workers in the colony. And you cannot wait till you reach that. So, and maybe kind of like, so that is connected. I have no idea about the swarming behavior of stingless bees and big stingless colonies. And so kind of like how to say, there's two things, swarming, and then kind of like even the tropical honeybees are migratory, right? So they also kind of like change or relocate their nests. And then kind of like also they always need to kind of like pump up the worker population. Maybe it has more to do with that instead of with environmental conditions.
Maybe it's a possibility. I mean, stingless bees, they have this very slow colony reproduction processes where a colony, not all of the colonies can do it. I mean, they go to they look for a new nesting site and very close. Often it's a few meters only from the first nesting site. They go to the next and they provide the nest with all the necessary material, and afterwards the queen goes there, the virgin queen goes there to the new nesting site. So it might have to do, I mean, it's a far slower process than it's in honeybees. So in honeybees, since they need frequently to boost up their colony, their colony size, maybe this need for accelerated development, maybe this has to do with the well, it might be interconnected. I mean, you never know what was first, if there was the thermoregulation was first and afterwards came the other, or vice versa. There's a nice input also from Vidur here on this topic, who says that temperature that in tropical regions, they might be adapted. They not really need to be adapted to a wide range of temperatures, given that the temperatures don't change too much, and they are adapted to a narrow temperature range. The animals in temperate regions are more temperature generalists, given that they have to live with a far wider range of ambient temperatures. This is certainly, I guess it's certainly true, but the question is, in this case, why did the honeybees evolve an effective thermoregulation, and the stingless bees didn't? Because both appeared in tropical climates, as a matter of fact. So. But the honeybee, but it's I mean, it's different lineages of development, and one lineage, the Apis lineage, went with let's spend much energy and try this, and the stingless bees said, oh well, let's spend less energy and try a different lifestyle. So, and both are effective in their way. I mean, honeybees are far more competitive and far more efficient as invaders than our stingless bees.
So perhaps just evolving a larger colony size meant that there might have been a tendency with a whole bunch of animals flying and coming back, larger colonies could get heated up just by the occupants. So maybe because of having a huge colony, even if honeybees originated in the tropics, there was a need to have a cooling mechanism, and then perhaps that could have been co-opted to survive in temperate regions.
Yeah.
What about the architecture of the nest? I mean, I have no idea about stingless bees, but maybe even the architecture of the nest kind of inhibits.
Oh yeah, sure. I think that
regulate-
the nest architecture of stingless bees is a very exciting research topic, even more so associated with thermoregulation. You can't unify again. You can't draw a general picture on nest architecture of stingless bees, but we have ground nesting species, we have cavity nesting species, we have open, like they build their own nest species. And usually if you have this tree and cavity nesting species, you have a long entrance tube. And the nest is rather, it depends on the species as well. But it's inside a more thermally isolated environment. There's a very nice thing about a species from São Paulo. I'm not sure if it's only São Paulo state or it occurs in other states as well. They live inside the ground. They live like 2 meters below ground level, have a long entrance tube, and below the colony, beneath the colony, they have a cavity filled with animal feces. And these animal feces, they heat up the colony. So they have a kind of a feces regulation, a feces thermal regulation here in the colony. So it's very nice. I excavated once one of these colonies, where it's a very unpleasant smell to get out the colony, but a very nice thing to see. It is one of the things I want to study, how far this heating mechanism, how far this is helps the colonies. And another thing we saw in the northeastern species, that most you have usually the nest combs, the brood combs, the brood combs. And in contrast to honeybees, the stingless bees, they have their storage pots. So they have pots which are like egg-shaped things where they store their pollen and their nectar. So they don't store it within the combs. And in this northeastern species, the honey pots are usually below the nesting or the brood combs. And frequently they open and close these honey pots. So it might be that this opening and closing of the honey pots has something to do with some kind of evaporative cooling mechanism, because what we saw is that there were at some points where they opened the pots, the temperature went down a little. So it might be something associated. So the nest architecture and the way that they place storage pots and brood combs might be associated with some kind of thermoregulation, but not one that spends a lot of energy. As we have in honeybees.
I mean, I'm sorry so it's interesting. So could it be, if you see in stingless bees, actually the evolution of non-bee kind of like thermoregulation mechanism, that could be an argument for that maybe kind of a thermoregulation by the bees themselves is not possible for whatever reason.
I think, I'm not sure if it's not possible, because we have in stingless bees, we have in the in southern Brazil, we have stingless bee species which have to cope with ambient temperatures close to 0. And there we have bees that heat up the colony. So we have these incubators, which increase their thoracic temperature to incubate, to increase the brood temperature. We have fanning, wing fanning as cooling mechanism. We have water collection as cooling mechanism. So the possibility, the bees have the possibility. For some reason, most of them don't use it, which is a very philosophical point. So of why don't they use it? They can do it, but they don't use it. Which is
They like
maybe
the tropics too much.
I guess so. I guess so. that's my conclusion here.
No, I mean,
Anthony.
it's kind of, I'm sorry, it's kind of interesting if it's kind of like, it could even be that the behavior is possible on the individual level, but the colony cannot kind of generate as a collaborative work, right? That's, I don't know. Christoph.
Anthony has a question.
It's more just an observation of I live in New York State, and an interesting thing about high temperatures is the consideration of using it to control or eliminate Varroa mites in the hive. So Apis has the ability, I guess, to tolerate heat for a short period of time of 44 Celsius or 112 degrees, but Varroa seems to die at that temperature. So there are now attempts to use these heating systems to heat up the hive to treat and kill the Varroa that way, as opposed to using, an arachnicide or, some kind of a chemical treatment or organic treatment. So it's interesting to see, how heat plays into, benefits to the hive or not. And so this talk was great to learn a lot about that. So thanks.
Thanks, Anthony, for that input. There's a recent study actually on that topic that compared the thermal sensitivity of Varroa and Apis mellifera, and they showed exactly that what you said, Anthony, that the Varroa mites, they're not really resistant to warming, not really heating, because they heated up, I think, at 38 degrees Celsius, which was not too much. And so it's just a little bit of heat that already inhibited the Varroa mites, which is very, very interesting to see. And that, maybe as a good, interesting input, Anthony, for the discussion.
Yeah, the high temperatures that we've been having out west, where they've been getting up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. People are thinking, oh, this is going to get rid of our Varroa, but they don't realize, the hive is still thermoregulating and keeping the temperature down. So it's not quite that effective on it, but
it would be effective in stingless bees, but not in honeybees.
Now, do stingless bees have any kind of predator parasite that?
They have a lot of I mean, that they are rather less studied with this respect, mostly because they are not as, let's say, important honey producers as our honeybees. So the economical value, and it's always you get research money if you have an economic value behind it. The economic value of stingless bees is, at least for honey production, is not as interesting. They're more interesting for pollination purposes. And there are recent studies, and the studies are increasing, showing the both parasites and predators of stingless bee colonies. There are also some mites. They don't have the varroa mites, but there are other mites that at least attack the forages. It's not sure yet whether they are transferred to the brood, but they have big problem with forage flies, which lay their eggs within the pollen pods, and the larvae of these flies, they just eat up all the pollen. And in case they get into, they don't eat the bees as such, but they in case they get into the brood combs, they eat the food of the larvae, and the larvae die consequently. We saw some very nice mantis fly predators predation process, which is a very creepy animal actually, that goes, we never found out how they got into the colonies, but it really devastated several stingless bee colonies, because they put their eggs into the eggs got, we don't even know how the eggs got into the brood combs, but the brood combs were suddenly filled with these mantis fly larvae, and they devorated the stingless bee larvae. So just nice. It was not it was sad to see, but on the other hand, it was nice to see this predation process in progress.
Yeah.
And so there are increasing number of studies looking at this point, but not as much focus so far as there's in honeybees.
Yeah.
But thanks, Andrew.
Yep, thanks.
Okay. Any last question that somebody would like to ask? Well, if not, I would like to thank you again, Michael, for your presentation. It was a pleasure to hear about stingless bees and to talk about stingless bees. And thank you to the listeners. And I hope to see many of you again next week, which is going to be our last presentation by Tom Seeley. Axel, we wanted to maybe discuss briefly format, but maybe that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there are too many, too few people, not too many. Too few.
But yeah, have a great day and have a great week, and hopefully see you next week.
I also would like to thank you for this nice conference here, and the participation of the listeners, which is very exciting to see that other people are interested in bees.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the big discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.